My name is Claire Bouchard, and for 8 years I worked as an RCMP dispatcher in Whitehorse. It's a job that hollows you out if you let it. You become a collector of tragedies, a switchboard for human misery. You learn to build a wall around your heart, to keep your voice steady while someone on the other end of the line is watching their world crumble. You take the information, you send the help, and you hang up. You compartmentalize. But there's one call from a frigid February morning in 2019 that breached all my defenses. It's the call that I can still hear in the dead of night, the one that ultimately made me quit. It was a Tuesday just before 10 a.m. The air outside was a brittle 35 degrees C. The call came from a woman named Emma Russo. Her voice was a thin wire stretched to the breaking point. She was trying so hard to be calm, to be the good witness, but the panic was a sharp, metallic taste under every word. She was calling to report her boyfriend, Marcus LeBlanc, as a missing person. Marcus was the quintessential Yukon man, the kind of rugged, self-reliant individual the territory is built on. He was a 34-year-old heavy equipment operator who had worked the gold fields around Dawson City for nearly a decade. He could troubleshoot a hydraulic system in a blizzard, navigate backcountry roads that were little more than suggestions on a map, and according to Emma, he was the most reliable person she had ever known. He always called when he said he would. He always came home. That was the crux of her terror. He had left their home in Whitehorse early Saturday morning, driving his distinctive royal blue Ford F-150. His destination was the old Bear Creek compound, a sprawling industrial ghost town about 10 kilometers east of Dawson City. From 1905 to 1966, it had been the bustling headquarters for the Yukon Consolidated Gold Corporation, a city unto itself with machine shops, offices, and residences. Now, it was an abandoned relic, owned by Parks Canada but closed to the public for years due to severe mercury contamination from the old gold extraction processes. It was a place frozen in time, slowly being reclaimed by the unforgiving wilderness. Marcus wasn't some illegal scavenger looking to strip copper wire. He was a professional. Through his network, he'd heard whispers that the compound's massive machine shop still held a treasure trove of salvageable parts, hydraulic pumps, electrical components, steel cables, things that could be refurbished and used in modern mining operations. He had gone through all the official channels, obtaining a permit from Parks Canada to survey the site. He'd paid the required fees and had even arranged for any materials he removed to be properly documented and decontaminated. His plan was simple and methodical: spend Saturday surveying what was available, camp overnight in his truck to get an early start, and then load up anything worthwhile on Sunday before driving back. Sunday evening came and went with no word. Emma, trying to be rational, initially assumed he'd found more than he anticipated and decided to stay an extra day. That was plausible. But when all of Monday passed in absolute deafening silence, no phone calls, no text messages, and no response on his satellite phone, a cold, hard knot of fear began to form in her stomach. A satellite phone was his lifeline, his guarantee of contact in a land full of cellular dead zones. For him not to answer it meant one of two things: either he couldn't or he wouldn't. Both possibilities were terrifying. That's when she called us. As she gave me the details, Marcus's full name, his date of birth, the truck's license plate, the precise location he had gone, a chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature crept down my spine. What I didn't tell her, what I couldn't tell her, was that we had already received reports of unusual activity in that exact area over the weekend. On Sunday evening, two separate callers, both living several kilometers from the Bear Creek site, had contacted us to report hearing what sounded like a man screaming in abject terror. Sound travels with an eerie clarity in the cold, dry air of a Yukon winter. The screams had been brief, lasting only a few minutes each time, but they were loud enough and disturbing enough that these hardened, no-nonsense Yukoners felt compelled to call the police. At the time, we had logged it as a possible vehicle breakdown or a minor accident. A patrol car had been sent to check the main access road to Bear Creek, but the officer had found no vehicles, no tracks, no signs of distress. The screaming had stopped by the time he arrived, and with no further reports, the incident was filed away. Now, with Emma's call providing a timeline and a name, those disembodied screams took on a much more sinister significance. I immediately dispatched 2 patrol units to the Bear Creek compound with instructions to conduct a thorough search of the entire area. I also contacted our search and rescue coordinator, putting them on standby for helicopter support. Something about this situation felt deeply wrong. The first patrol unit arrived at Bear Creek at approximately 11:15 a.m. The officer's voice, when he radioed in, was a mixture of confusion and alarm. He had located Marcus's blue Ford pickup. It was parked in the main compound area, positioned right near the entrance to the massive, cavernous machine shop building. Exactly where someone conducting a salvage survey would logically park. The truck's engine was still running, after sitting there for nearly 3 days in temperatures that had plunged to 30 below zero at night. The engine was still idling, a low, steady rumble in the profound silence. The fuel gauge showed the tank was nearly empty. The driver's side door was standing wide open, swaying slightly in the wind. A light snow had fallen on Sunday night, blanketing the ground in a pristine, unbroken layer of white. There were no footprints leading away from the vehicle. It was as if Marcus LeBlanc had stepped out of his truck and simply vanished into thin air. But the scene inside the cab was what turned this from a mystery into a horror story. On the passenger seat lay Marcus's heavy winter parka, the insulated, life-saving garment that no sane person would voluntarily remove in sub-zero temperatures. The jacket was soaked with blood, not frozen, not discolored, but fresh, dark, and wet, as if the incident had happened only moments ago. The fabric was torn in several places, ripped with a violence that suggested it had been clawed or torn from his body. The interior of the truck's cab was a scene of frantic struggle. There were deep scratches gouged into the plastic of the dashboard and the interior door panels, marks that looked like they had been made by fingernails or perhaps claws scrabbling for purchase. On the dashboard, next to a thermos that impossibly still contained warm coffee, was Marcus's satellite phone. The device was functional, showing a full battery, but there were no outgoing calls or messages after Saturday morning. His regular cell phone was found on the floor of the truck, its screen cracked as if it had been dropped or thrown in a moment of panic. And the most chilling detail of all, the truck's radio was tuned to the emergency frequency and the volume was turned up to maximum. It was the posture of a man about to scream for help, a man who had been interrupted before he could make a sound. The search expanded. Teams swept through every decaying building in the Bear Creek compound, their flashlights cutting through decades of dust and gloom. They searched the machine shop, the administrative buildings, the old residential structures, and the maintenance facilities. They found no sign of Marcus, no blood trail, no drag marks, no indication of where he might have gone after leaving his truck. The only other unusual discovery was inside the machine shop itself. Several pieces of heavy equipment, massive hydraulic pumps and steel machinery that would normally require specialized tools and multiple people to relocate, had been shifted from their original positions. They had been moved around as if someone or something with enormous, impossible strength had been rearranging them like furniture. The search effort continued for 6 agonizing days. It involved dozens of volunteers from the local community and professional search and rescue personnel from across the territory. Helicopters crisscrossed the Klondike River Valley. Ground teams followed every possible trail and access road. We even brought in specialized cadaver dogs from Edmonton. We never found Marcus LeBlanc, not a single trace of him beyond that blood-soaked jacket in his idling truck. The investigation officially remains open, classified as a missing person case. But everyone involved knows that something terrible and inexplicable happened to Marcus at Bear Creek compound that Saturday morning. The blood evidence confirmed he had suffered a life-threatening trauma. The torn jacket and scratched interior of his truck suggested a violent struggle. But the complete absence of any trail, combined with the impossibly heavy equipment that had been moved, pointed to something that did not fit any normal criminal or animal attack scenario. 3 months after Marcus disappeared, Emma Russo received a formal letter from Parks Canada. It informed her that the Bear Creek compound was being permanently closed to all public access. The official reason given was environmental remediation and ongoing safety concerns. But those of us who had been involved in the investigation knew the real reason. Too many strange incidents had been reported at that site over the years. Equipment mysteriously moved overnight, unexplained sounds coming from the abandoned buildings. And now, Marcus's impossible disappearance. Whatever was happening at Bear Creek, the authorities had decided it was too dangerous to allow anyone else to get close. To this day, local residents in the Dawson area sometimes report hearing screams from the direction of Bear Creek compound on cold, still winter nights when the wind is silent. The sounds are always brief, lasting just a few minutes, but loud enough to carry for kilometers across the frozen landscape. Some people claim the screaming sounds like Marcus calling for help, though that could just be the imagination of people who knew him and remember the case. What I know for certain is that Marcus LeBlanc went to Bear Creek to salvage some equipment on a routine Saturday morning, and he never came home. His truck was found running with the door open and his jacket soaked in blood. But Marcus himself had vanished as completely as if he had never existed at all. My name is Jean-Baptiste Morin. What I'm about to tell you is not a story I share. In fact, for over 2 decades, only one other person knew the truth of what happened. But he's gone now, and I feel a responsibility to honor his memory and the warning we received. It happened in the summer of 1997 when I was 16. My cousin Etienne and I were camping alone for the first time, a rite of passage our parents had reluctantly agreed to. They sent us to McIntyre Park, a well-maintained but remote campground just outside the small community of Mayo, deep in the heart of the Yukon. The park sits on the banks of the Mayo River, a wide, cold artery fed by the snowmelt from the surrounding mountains. The water is crystal clear and frigid even in June. We spent the first 3 days of our week-long trip feeling like true frontiersmen, catching Arctic grayling and cooking them over our campfire, blissfully unaware of the ancient world that lay just beneath the surface of our own. The 4th night was June 21st, the summer solstice. In the Yukon, at that latitude, the sun doesn't truly set. It just dips below the horizon for a short while, leaving the world bathed in an ethereal, otherworldly twilight that lasts for hours. The light is dim but clear, painting the landscape in shades of blue and purple and making everything look slightly unreal. Etienne, who was always the more adventurous of the two of us, insisted we take advantage of the twilight for some late-night fishing. He was convinced the bigger fish would be more active in the cooler hours. I was tired and would have preferred to sleep, but his enthusiasm was infectious. Around midnight, we launched our small aluminum boat and paddled out to the middle of the river, where the current was slower and the water ran deep. The world was perfectly calm and silent, save for the gentle lapping of water against the hull and the occasional splash of a fish somewhere in the gloaming. We anchored and began casting our lines, whispering so as not to disturb the peace of the evening. For about an hour, we had moderate success catching a few decent-sized grayling, The twilight was just beginning to fade towards true darkness when Etienne suddenly grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my bicep. He didn't say a word, just pointed with a trembling hand toward the far shore. Something was moving in the water. A V-shaped wake was cutting through the glassy surface, heading directly for our boat. Our first thought was a beaver, or maybe a moose crossing the river. Both were common sights. The size of the wake seemed about right for a large beaver, and it moved with a steady, purposeful rhythm. We relaxed, expecting it to pass us by. But as the creature drew closer, it became chillingly apparent that this was no animal we knew. The swimming pattern was wrong. Beavers swim with their heads and backs visible. This thing was almost entirely submerged, with only the very top of its head, slicing through the water, moving with a fluid, almost serpentine grace that was deeply unnatural. The wake it created was too large, too consistent, suggesting something with immense power propelling it from beneath. When it reached a shallow sandbar about 10 meters from our boat, the creature suddenly stood upright. It didn't lumber to its feet like a bear getting on its hind legs. It rose smoothly, seamlessly, like something that was designed to be bipedal, transitioning from a swimming to a standing position with an eerie lack of effort. It was now standing in waist-deep water, and we could see it clearly in the fading twilight. What we saw made no sense. The creature stood approximately 2.5 meters tall, with elongated, slender limbs that seemed slightly out of proportion for its torso. Its skin appeared dark and slick, either naturally colored or just wet. But the most disturbing feature, the one that burned itself into my memory, was its eyes. They were large and almond-shaped, and they glowed with a steady internal yellow light, like the reflective eyes of a cat caught in headlights, but far brighter and more intense. The glow was strong enough that we could see the details of its face, which was vaguely humanoid but subtly wrong. The proportions were off, as if a sculptor had tried to recreate a human face from a flawed memory. For several long minutes, the creature simply stood there in the water, watching us with those intelligent, glowing yellow eyes. Neither Etienne nor I moved. We didn't even breathe. We were frozen by a primal fear mixed with a strange, horrified fascination. We were in the presence of something that should not exist. Then it spoke. Its voice was clear and strong, carrying easily across the water despite the fact that it was speaking in a normal, conversational tone. And it spoke in perfect, old-fashioned French. Not the French we learned in school, but the archaic dialect our grandparents used, full of expressions and pronunciations that had been preserved in the isolated pockets of the Yukon for generations. "You should not be here while the earth is awakening," it said, its voice calm but resonant with an ancient authority. "The permafrost is melting. Things that should stay buried are rising to the surface." Before either of us could process its words, the creature raised one of its long, slender arms and pointed toward the riverbank behind us. Suddenly, our vision was torn away from the boat, from the river. Our minds were flooded with images that were not coming through our eyes but were being projected directly into our consciousness. We saw the Yukon landscape as it had existed thousands of years ago during the last ice age. It was a vast grassy plain populated by massive creatures that dwarfed anything in the modern world. Woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats. But mixed in with these familiar prehistoric beasts were other things. Creatures that belonged in nightmares, not in any paleontology textbook. Things with too many legs or eyes, predators with impossible twisted anatomies, and worst of all, beings that looked almost human but were clearly something else entirely, their forms radiating a palpable malevolence. We watched in silent mental horror as these nightmare creatures hunted and killed both the familiar Ice Age animals and each other, turning the ancient landscape into a battleground of unimaginable violence. The vision shifted, We saw the climate changing, the great ice sheets advancing. We saw these creatures dying, but instead of simply becoming extinct and decaying, they were being frozen into the forming permafrost. The creature in the river showed us layer after layer of permanently frozen ground, each layer a tomb containing the perfectly preserved remains of things that had lived and died during different epochs. And a horrifying realization washed over us. Some of these remains were not dead, but dormant, waiting in a state of suspended animation for the ice to melt and release them back into the world. As the vision continued, we saw the present-day Yukon. We saw mining equipment tearing into the tundra, saw roads and buildings causing the permafrost to thaw at a rate faster than ever before. We watched as the melting ice released first the familiar Ice Age animals that paleontologists were already discovering, then the DNA and bacteria from prehistoric organisms, and finally, the things that were still alive, still waiting, still hungry after tens of thousands of years of frozen sleep. The creature lowered its arm and the visions stopped as abruptly as they had begun. We were back in our boat on the Mayo River, trembling and gasping for air, staring at the impossible thing standing in the water. Our minds struggled to process what we had just been shown. The creature looked at us for a few more moments, its glowing eyes seeming to pierce right through us. Then it spoke again, its voice, a solemn command. "Zotu," it said, using an ancient form of the word go. "Tell the others what you have seen. Presser. Time is running short and they must prepare." Without another word, the creature sank back beneath the surface of the river and disappeared. One moment it was there, a solid, terrifying presence. The next, there were only ripples spreading outward from where it had been. We never told anyone the full story. Who would have believed us, two teenage boys claiming to have met a talking river monster that showed them visions of prehistoric horrors? We would have been laughed at, or worse, sent for psychological evaluation. We cut our trip short and told our parents we were homesick. But the years that followed proved that the creature had been telling us the truth. Etienne went on to study geology at the University of Alberta and later became a leading specialist in permafrost research, working for the Yukon Geological Survey. His entire career has been dedicated to studying the effects of climate change on the frozen ground, and he has confirmed everything that the creature showed us that night. The permafrost is indeed melting at an unprecedented rate, releasing preserved organic material that has been frozen for millennia. The scientific discoveries that have been made in the Yukon over the past 2 decades read like a catalog of the visions we were shown. Perfectly preserved woolly mammoth calves, ancient wolf pups with their DNA intact. And most disturbing of all, microorganisms and bacteria that have been dormant in the ice for tens of thousands of years but are still viable when thawed. The scientific community celebrates these discoveries as windows into the prehistoric past. But Etienne and I knew they were something much more dangerous. Every few years, Etienne would call me, his voice always carrying the same undertone of deep-seated concern. He'd tell me about some new discovery in the permafrost, some new creature or organism that had been found in the melting ground. He tried to raise concerns within the scientific community about the potential dangers of a widespread thaw. But his warnings were always dismissed as overly cautious or sensationalistic. I believe that the creature we encountered in the Mayo River that night was some kind of guardian or sentinel, something that had been watching over the frozen ground for thousands of years, maintaining the balance between the living world and the things that were meant to stay buried. Its warning was not just about climate change or environmental destruction. It was about something much more fundamental and terrifying. The permafrost is not just a layer of frozen soil. It is a prison, and the locks are melting. My grandfather, Henri Gagnon, was a hunting guide in the Yukon for over 40 years. He was a legend in the territory, a man who understood the wilderness not just as a landscape, but as a living, breathing entity with its own moods and dangers. He'd guided hundreds of expeditions from wealthy American executives to European royalty, and his reputation was built on two things: finding trophy-class game and, more importantly, bringing every single client back home alive. But in October of 1987, a trip to the haunted ridges of Keno Hill broke that perfect record and shattered something deep inside him. The official RCMP report concluded that 4 experienced hunters from Ontario died in a tragic accidental fall down an abandoned mine shaft. That's the story the public knows. My grandfather told me the truth on his deathbed in 2003, and it was a truth far more terrifying than any simple accident. The 4 hunters were all successful businessmen from the Toronto area, men in their 40s and 50s who had been coming to the Yukon for an annual hunting trip for over a decade. Richard Lamont, a real estate mogul; Thomas Brennan, a construction magnate; David McLeod, a high-powered corporate accountant; and their group leader, William Sinclair, a retired military officer known for his meticulous planning. These were not weekend warriors. They were serious, competent men who respected the wilderness and had hunted with my grandfather on 3 previous occasions. He considered them among his most reliable clients. For their 1987 trip, they specifically requested to hunt in the area around Keno Hill. My grandfather was hesitant and warned them against it. The historic Silver Trail region was notoriously treacherous. Decades of mining had left the landscape riddled with hundreds of abandoned mine shafts, some of them hundreds of feet deep, their openings often hidden by overgrown vegetation. It was a place where a single careless step could send you plunging into the cold, dark earth. But the hunters were insistent. The remote, high-altitude terrain of Keno Hill was known for having some of the largest moose and caribou in the territory, animals that had seen little pressure from human hunters. The allure of a record-breaking trophy was too strong. Reluctantly, my grandfather agreed on the strict condition that they follow his safety protocols without question. They established their base camp in a sheltered valley a few kilometers southwest of the main Keno Hill mining complex, far enough from the densest concentration of shafts to be safe, but close enough to the prime hunting grounds. The first 2 days of the expedition went perfectly. The weather was cool and clear, with a light dusting of snow that made tracking easy. On the second day, Thomas Brennan bagged a magnificent bull moose with a rack that would make any hunter weep with envy. The next day, David McLeod took a trophy caribou. The mood in the camp was jubilant. This was shaping up to be the hunt of a lifetime. That was when things began to go wrong in a way that defied all logical explanation. My grandfather woke up before dawn on the 4th morning to the unnerving silence of the camp. The usual sounds of men stirring in their tents were absent. He called out their names, no response. He got out of his tent and walked over to theirs. They were empty. All 4 hunters were gone. A cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He quickly checked their gear. Their sleeping bags were still laid out, some still holding the faint warmth of their bodies. Their personal belongings were untouched. Their heavy, insulated winter clothing was still hanging on the makeshift clotheslines they'd strung up. Their hunting rifles were still propped against the tent walls where they always kept them at night. And most disturbingly, their heavy insulated hunting boots were all sitting right outside their tent flaps, exactly where they'd left them. All 4 men had walked away from camp in the middle of a sub-zero night, wearing nothing but their long underwear and socks. My grandfather, a master tracker who could read the story of a bent twig or a displaced stone, immediately began to search for tracks. He found them in the thin layer of snow. The sight made the blood run cold in his veins. The footprints were the right size and shape to have been made by the 4 missing hunters. but they were wrong in ways he struggled to describe even years later. They showed no signs of the hesitation, the stumbling, or the careful, pained stepping that would be expected from men walking barefoot through frozen, rocky ground. Instead, the tracks showed a steady, purposeful, rhythmic stride. Even more disturbing, the tracks were perfectly spaced and aligned, as if all four men had been walking in a single, synchronized file, with exactly the same stride length and pace. It was the gait of automatons, not men. He followed the trail, his own hunting rifle held at the ready, his senses screaming that he was tracking something that was no longer entirely human. The trail led away from the safety of the valley and climbed steadily upward, directly toward the old Kino Hill mining complex. It wound through dense, dark forest and across treacherous, rock-strewn slopes that would have been agonizing for anyone in bare feet. The tracks never wavered. After following the unnatural trail for over 2 kilometers, my grandfather began to feel a genuine primal fear. He realized the tracks were leading directly toward some of the deepest and most dangerous mine shafts in the entire district. The major production shafts that dropped straight down for hundreds, sometimes thousands of feet into the black heart of the earth. He finally caught up with them on a desolate, windswept ridge. What he saw convinced him that he was witnessing something that had no place in the natural world. Richard, Thomas, David, and William were standing in a perfect, motionless circle around the gaping maw of the Leduc shaft, one of the deepest and most notorious mines in the Kino Hill district. They were standing at the very edge, their bare toes curling over the precipice, staring straight down into the darkness below. Their feet and lower legs were a waxy purplish blue with cold, and fine ice crystals had formed in their hair and on their skin, but they showed no signs of shivering or discomfort. My grandfather called out to them, his voice cracking in the frigid air. None of them responded or even acknowledged his presence. He approached them carefully, his heart pounding against his ribs. As he got closer, he could see that their eyes were wide open but completely unfocused and glassy, as if they were looking at something far away rather than the abyss directly in front of them. Their breathing was slow, shallow, and most terrifying of all, they were all breathing in perfect, eerie synchronization, their chests rising and falling as one, as if they were sharing a single set of lungs. My grandfather tried everything. He screamed their names, he shook them by the shoulders, he even slapped their faces. The sound sharp and ugly in the silence. Nothing. It was like trying to wake statues. They remained perfectly still, their blank gazes fixed on the darkness below, their bodies held in a state of absolute thrall. He felt a palpable wrongness in the air, a psychic pressure, like a low, inaudible hum that vibrated in his bones. It was the feeling of a powerful, malevolent will focused entirely on the four men at the edge of the shaft. After 10 minutes of frantic, useless effort, he made the agonizing decision to leave them. He knew they were in immediate danger from hypothermia, but whatever was holding them was beyond his ability to fight alone. He had to get help. He turned and ran, forcing his legs to carry him back down the treacherous slope to the camp and the emergency radio. The hike back and the radio call to the RCMP detachment in Mayo took nearly 2 hours. He tried to explain the situation as clearly as he could, knowing full well that his account of 4 men standing motionless around a mine shaft in their underwear sounded like the ravings of a madman. To their credit, the dispatcher assured him that a rescue helicopter would be dispatched immediately. But the wilderness is vast, and help is never fast enough. It was another 3 hours before the helicopter arrived and my grandfather could lead the RCMP officers and paramedics back up the ridge to the Leduc shaft. When they arrived, the 4 hunters were no longer standing around the opening. They were at the bottom of it, more than 300 feet below ground level. All 4 of them were dead, their bodies broken and twisted from the fall. The recovery operation took 2 days. The official investigation was brief. The coroner concluded that the men, disoriented for unknown reasons, had wandered from their camp, become lost, and had accidentally fallen into the mine shaft. Case closed. Accidental death. My grandfather never accepted that explanation, and neither do I. Men do not accidentally fall into a mine shaft while standing around its perimeter in a perfect circle. They do not all fall at exactly the same time. And they do not walk 2 kilometers through the snow in their bare feet to get there unless something is compelling them to do so. In the years that followed, my grandfather quietly researched the history of the Keno Hill mining district. What he discovered was a dark, hidden pattern of strange disappearances and unexplained deaths that stretched back to the very beginning of mining operations in the area. He found old newspaper clippings and company records detailing workers who had walked away from their jobs in the middle of their shifts and were later found dead at the bottom of mine shafts. Entire work crews who had vanished overnight, leaving behind their tools and personal belongings. Miners who had reported hearing voices or a strange, captivating music calling to them from the depths of the shafts. Voices that spoke in languages they did not recognize but somehow understood. The mining companies had covered up these incidents, listing the missing workers as having quit or moved on. Dead miners were bad for business. Supernaturally compelled miners were even worse. My grandfather came to believe that something lives in the depths of those Keno Hill mines, something ancient and patient that was disturbed when the miners first broke through into the deep, dark chambers where it had been sleeping. It feeds not on flesh but on life force, on will, drawing people to the shafts through some form of mental compulsion that overrides their survival instincts and reduces them to mindless walking puppets. The 4 hunters from Ontario were just its latest meal in a pattern of predation that has been continuing for over a century. My grandfather stopped guiding in the Keno Hill area after 1987, and he spent the rest of his life warning others to stay away. Some listened, some did not, and every few years another hunting accident would be reported from that haunted land. My name is Robert Sinclair, and for 23 years I was a forensic investigator for the Yukon Territory's Major Crimes Unit. In this line of work, you see the worst of humanity. You learn that evil isn't a concept, it's a tangible thing that walks and breathes among us. But the case of 1992, the one the press dubbed the Northern Lights Butcher, was different. It wasn't about a crime of passion or greed. It was about a methodical, patient predator who operated in plain sight, turning the Yukon's transient nature into his personal hunting ground. This case uncovered a level of depravity so profound it recalibrated my understanding of human evil. It began not with a bang, but with a slow, creeping realization. Over the summer and fall of 1992, 6 men vanished from various mining operations in and around Whitehorse. In the Yukon, this wasn't immediately alarming. The workforce, especially in the mines, is largely transient. Men come from all over the country for a season of hard labor, make their money, and move on. It was common for a worker to simply pack up and leave without notice, chasing a rumor of a better-paying gig in the next valley. Foremen were used to it. But by October, a pattern began to emerge from the background noise of this constant turnover. An analyst with the RCMP noticed the similarities. All 6 missing men were French-Canadian. All were between the ages of 25 and 40. All were single, with no close family ties in the territory to raise an immediate alarm. And in every case, they had vanished without taking their personal belongings or, most tellingly, collecting their final hard-earned paychecks. These men weren't leaving for a better job. They were simply ceasing to exist. I was assigned as the lead investigator. My first step was to build a victimology to find the common thread that tied these men together. I interviewed their supervisors, their co-workers, the owners of the rooming houses where they stayed. They were all described as hard workers, quiet men trying to get by. The breakthrough came when I started looking into their social lives. I discovered that all 6 men had been regulars at the same rough-and-tumble bar in downtown Whitehorse, the Northern Lights Tavern. It was a place that catered specifically to miners, construction workers, and other transient laborers. A place where a man could feel anonymous. More significantly, several witnesses reported seeing the missing men on separate occasions, talking to the same individual. He was a well-known, and by all accounts well-respected local businessman named Douglas MacLeod. MacLeod had moved to Whitehorse from Saskatchewan in the mid-'80s and had built a successful business supplying tools, machinery parts, and other equipment to mining operations throughout the territory. He was considered a pillar of the business community, reliable, friendly, and fair. MacLeod was also known to frequent the Northern Lights Tavern. Witnesses described how he would often buy drinks for out-of-work miners, striking up conversations about job openings at various remote sites. He presented himself as a helpful go-between, a man with connections. According to several people I interviewed, they had seen MacLeod talking to each of the missing men in the weeks leading up to their disappearances. The conversations always followed a similar script. MacLeod would approach a worker who seemed down on his luck, mention that he knew of better opportunities at a remote camp that needed experienced hands, and then offer to provide transportation to the job site himself. To men who were struggling financially, isolated, and far from home, this offer of a helping hand from a successful local was incredibly attractive. It was a lifeline. Based on this strong circumstantial link, I obtained a search warrant for MacLeod's business premises and his residence. What we found at his home, a large, secluded house on 10 acres of heavily wooded property on the outskirts of Whitehorse, remains the most horrifying crime scene of my career. The house itself was unremarkable, a typical log construction. But the basement had been converted into something that belonged in a slaughterhouse. It was a fully equipped industrial-grade butcher shop. There were stainless steel cutting tables, commercial meat grinders, band saws, and multiple large walk-in freezers. The air was thick with the coppery smell of old blood, and it was immediately clear that this equipment had not been used for processing moose or caribou. Human remains were found in the industrial freezers, carefully dismembered, packaged in butcher paper, and meticulously labeled with dates and what appeared to be cuts of meat. Rump roast, July 92. Sirloin steaks, September 92. The cutting tables and saws showed microscopic traces of human blood and tissue. The most chilling discovery, however, was a detailed journal MacLeod had been keeping. In neat, precise handwriting, he documented his activities with the same dispassionate attention to detail he applied to his business ledgers. The journal entries described how he would identify potential victims at the Northern Lights Tavern, targeting those who were isolated and unlikely to be missed. He wrote about luring them to his property under the pretext of driving them to a new job site. Once they were in his house, he would drug them, kill them, and then process their bodies in his basement workshop. The journal made it clear that MacLeod was not just a serial killer, but also a cannibal, who had been consuming portions of his victims and preserving the rest for future consumption. The investigation revealed that he had been operating for at least 3 years, and the 6 men who had disappeared in 1992 were just the most recent victims in a much longer series of murders. Douglas MacLeod was arrested without incident at his business office. He showed no emotion, no resistance. In fact, he seemed almost relieved, as if the burden of maintaining his double life had become too exhausting. He provided a full, detailed confession for 12 murders, even assisting us in locating additional remains buried on his property. The final, most sickening revelation of the investigation was never released to the public. We discovered that McLeod, under the guise of being a generous hunter, had been gifting processed meat to several local restaurants and food service operations in Whitehorse, claiming it was wild game. Laboratory analysis confirmed that at least some of this meat had been human flesh. An unknown number of people in Whitehorse had unknowingly participated in his cannibalism. The authorities decided that releasing this information would cause a level of public panic and trauma that would serve no useful purpose. McLeod was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but he died of an apparent heart attack just 3 years into his sentence. His death left many questions unanswered, including the true number of his victims. The case served as a horrifying lesson. The most dangerous predators are often the ones who appear the most normal, the ones who integrate themselves so thoroughly into their communities that no one ever suspects the evil hiding behind their ordinary eyes. My name is Philippe Arsenault. In the spring of 1994, my wife, Marianne, and I thought we had found our own piece of paradise. We were living in Vancouver, burning out in the burgeoning tech industry, and we yearned for an escape. We found it in a remote cabin on the eastern shore of Lake Le Berge, about 50 kilometers north of Whitehorse. It was a beautiful log structure, accessible only by a narrow gravel road, promising the pristine wilderness and absolute silence we craved. We bought it for a song from a retired couple who, according to the real estate agent, were extremely motivated to sell. They left everything behind: furniture, a generator, even a small aluminum boat. At the time, we thought we were just lucky. We didn't understand they weren't just selling a property, they were fleeing it. For the first 8 months, the cabin was everything we had dreamed of. We spent long weekends hiking, fishing, and decompressing from city life. The vast, crystal-clear lake and the surrounding boreal forest were our sanctuary. We saw moose, caribou, and black bears. We felt like we had truly escaped. Then came our first winter. We decided to spend 2 weeks at the cabin over the Christmas holidays to experience a true Yukon winter. The landscape transformed. The lake froze into a solid 3-foot-thick sheet of ice. The temperature plummeted to a steady 42, and the daylight hours shrank to just a few hours of dim gray twilight. We were prepared with enough food and fuel to be snowed in for weeks. We were excited by the harsh beauty of it all. On our third night at the cabin, December 23rd, Marianne woke me up around midnight. Her voice was a hushed whisper of awe and confusion. "Philippe, look at the lake." I got up and went to our bedroom window, which overlooked the vast frozen expanse. I expected to see the aurora borealis, the familiar dancing curtains of green and purple light. But this was something else entirely. Beneath the surface of the frozen lake, distinct points of brilliant blue light were moving. There were about a dozen of them, each about the size and brightness of a streetlight, distributed across the portion of the lake visible from our cabin. They were clearly underwater, shining up through what had to be at least 3 feet of solid ice, yet they were bright enough to cast an eerie blue glow on the snow-covered surface above them. They moved in slow, deliberate, non-random patterns, sometimes individually, sometimes in small, synchronized groups. It was as if they were being controlled by some form of intelligence. We watched, mesmerized and increasingly unsettled, for over an hour. I tried to rationalize it. Bioluminescent organisms? I had never heard of any freshwater species that could produce that kind of sustained bright light, especially in such cold water. Underwater research equipment? The lake was far too remote and inaccessible in winter for that kind of operation. There was no logical explanation. The next morning, we put on our snowshoes and walked out onto the frozen lake to investigate the area where we had seen the lights. The ice was a solid, seamless sheet. There were no holes, no cracks, no thin spots. The snow on the surface was unmarked except for the delicate tracks of rabbits and ptarmigan. There was no physical evidence that could explain the mysterious lights. The lights appeared again on Christmas Eve, but this time they were significantly brighter and their movements were more complex. Instead of the slow, meandering patterns of the previous night, the lights began forming distinct geometric shapes beneath the ice. Triangles, squares, and more complex polygons would appear, hold their form for a few minutes, and then dissolve as the lights moved into new configurations. The patterns were too precise, too deliberate to be random. It was undeniably the work of an intelligence. Most disturbing of all, some of the patterns began to resemble letters and numbers, as if whatever was controlling the lights was attempting to communicate with us. On Christmas morning, Marianne made a discovery that turned our unease into genuine fear. The geometric patterns we had seen the night before were now physically etched into the surface of the ice itself. They were burned or melted into the surface with a precision that would have been impossible to achieve by any normal means. The lines were perfectly straight, the curves geometrically perfect, as if they had been created with a laser. The marks were about 3 inches deep and showed no signs of refreezing, suggesting that whatever had created them had generated an intense, localized heat. Over the following week, the phenomenon escalated. The lights became a nightly occurrence, and the patterns they created became more complex and recognizable. By New Year's Eve, we realized with a growing sense of dread that the lights were spelling out names and dates in the ice. Not random names, but specific names that we would later discover belonged to people who had drowned in Lake Le Berge over the past several decades. Sarah Mackenzie, 1973, Robert Wilson, 1981, Jennifer Lavoie, 1987, Marie Gagnon, 1990. Each name was accompanied by a date that corresponded to a documented drowning incident. The implications were terrifying. These were not natural phenomena or scientific anomalies. This was some form of supernatural communication from people who had died in the lake. The previous owners hadn't been motivated to sell. They had been terrified. Then the messages changed. On January 2nd, the lights began spelling out specific, desperate requests. "Find my body" appeared in the ice near the shore. "Tell my family what happened. Help us rest." The messages became increasingly emotional, with phrases like, "Please do not ignore us, and we have been waiting so long," burned into the surface of the lake. It became clear that the spirits were not just trying to communicate, they were actively seeking our help to resolve their unfinished business. Using the cabin's radio telephone, we contacted the RCMP detachment in Whitehorse and, feeling like madmen, requested information about missing persons cases associated with Lake Le Berge. We learned that 5 people had drowned in the lake over the past 20 years, but only 2 of the bodies had ever been recovered. The other 3 victims, Sarah Mackenzie, Marie Gagnon, and Jennifer Lavoie, had simply vanished beneath the surface, leaving their families in a state of perpetual, unresolved grief. Following the guidance provided by the spirits through their light patterns, we were able to determine the approximate locations where the missing bodies had come to rest on the bottom of the lake. The lights would congregate in specific areas, forming bright, stationary clusters that clearly indicated the locations of the remains. Using a GPS device, we recorded the coordinates of these locations and provided the information to the RCMP when we returned to Whitehorse. The officers were initially skeptical of our story about supernatural lights, but the specificity of our information compelled them to agree to investigate once the lake thawed. In May of 1995, professional divers working under RCMP supervision searched the locations we had identified. They recovered the remains of all 3 missing drowning victims from the exact spots that the spirits had indicated. After the bodies were recovered and the families were finally able to hold proper burials, the lights beneath Lake Le Berge disappeared completely. We returned to the cabin several times that summer, but the lake was just a lake again. The spirits had apparently found the peace they had been seeking. We sold the cabin that fall. Our purpose there had been fulfilled. We had been chosen, for reasons we still don't understand, to serve as intermediaries between the living and the dead, helping trapped souls find peace. The experience taught us that some places, particularly those associated with sudden traumatic death, can become bridges between different planes of existence, where the boundary between life and death becomes permeable, and the dead can, if someone is willing to listen, still speak. My name is Michelle Tremblay, and for 15 years, I've coordinated search and rescue operations out of Dawson City. In the Yukon, search and rescue often means body recovery. It's a harsh, unforgiving place where a small mistake can have fatal consequences. Most of the calls we receive, even the tragic ones, follow a predictable logic. But the incident in the Ogilvy Mountains in late August of 2003 was different. It was a case that defied all logical explanation, a story that still circulates in hushed tones among emergency responders as a cautionary tale about the places man was not meant to go. The subjects of the search were a team of 3 geologists from the University of British Columbia. They were in the Ogilvies, a remote mountain range near the Arctic Circle, conducting mineral surveys. The team was led by Dr. James Sinclair, a 45-year-old professor with over 2 decades of experience leading field expeditions in the Canadian Arctic. He was known for his meticulous attention to safety. With him were Dr. Sarah McLeod, a 32-year-old specialist in mineral exploration, and Martin Dubois, a 26-year-old graduate student. They were well equipped with sophisticated geological instruments, satellite communication gear, and enough supplies for 2 weeks. They had filed a detailed itinerary with our coordination center, including specific coordinates for their research sites and a strict schedule of twice-daily radio check-ins. For the first 4 days of their expedition, everything proceeded exactly according to plan. Dr. Sinclair made his scheduled radio contacts at 0800 and 1800 hours, reporting good progress and no safety concerns. The weather was perfect. Their final scheduled radio contact occurred on the evening of August 26th. Dr. Sinclair reported that they had completed their surveys in the immediate area of their base camp and were planning to spend the following day collecting samples from a ridge system a few kilometers away. He confirmed that all 3 team members were in good health and that all their equipment was functioning properly. The call was clear, routine, and utterly unremarkable. When the team failed to make their scheduled radio contact on the morning of August 27th, we immediately initiated emergency protocols. We made repeated attempts to raise them on both their primary and backup radio frequencies throughout the morning, but were met with nothing but static. By noon, with no contact, we officially activated our emergency response procedures and began preparations for a search and rescue mission. A helicopter with a SAR team was dispatched to the team's last known location that afternoon. When our helicopter arrived at the coordinates Dr. Sinclair had provided for their base camp, the search team immediately identified the site, but it was eerily empty. All 3 of their tents were still standing in perfect condition. The team's expensive, sensitive geological instruments were neatly arranged and still running, continuing to collect data as they had been programmed to do. A meal that appeared to have been in the process of being prepared was sitting on their camp stove, with utensils and dishes laid out as if the researchers had simply stepped away for a few minutes. Inside each tent, personal belongings were carefully organized, sleeping bags were unzipped. Field notebooks containing detailed research data were sitting open on camp tables, with the last entries dated August 26th. Most significantly, the team's emergency radio equipment was still functioning and had been left in the on position. They should have been able to hear our calls. Our helicopter team began conducting aerial reconnaissance of the surrounding area, a vast, rugged expanse of mountains and valleys. Ground teams were inserted to conduct more detailed searches. The effort continued for 3 days. We found no tracks, no signs of a struggle, no indication of an animal attack. It was as if 3 experienced, competent people had simply evaporated from their own campsite. On August 30th, 5 days after they had missed their radio check-in, the 3 researchers were discovered by one of our helicopter teams. They were found walking in slow, deliberate, synchronized circles around their own base camp, approximately 50 meters from their tents. They were moving in a pattern that formed a perfect circle with a diameter of about 20 meters. They had been walking in this circle for so long that they had worn a clearly visible deep path into the ground. When our rescue personnel approached them, the researchers showed no recognition of the helicopter or the search team. They just continued walking in their circular pattern, staring straight ahead with blank, unfocused expressions, apparently completely unaware of their surroundings or their own dire condition. They did not respond to verbal commands, physical contact, or medical examination. Their movements were mechanical and perfectly synchronized, as if they were all following the same invisible set of instructions. All 3 were suffering from severe hypothermia, dehydration, and exhaustion, despite the fact that they had been just meters away from adequate food, water, and shelter for days. They were immediately evacuated to the hospital in Whitehorse. Physical examinations revealed no signs of injury, illness, or drug intoxication that could explain their bizarre behavior. But their minds were a blank slate. Psychological evaluations conducted over the following weeks revealed that all 3 researchers had complete and total memory loss regarding the period from the evening of August 26th until they woke up in the hospital. They remembered making their final radio call, but they had no recollection of anything that happened after that point. Medical tests, including brain scans and extensive blood work, revealed no abnormalities that could account for their amnesia or their strange, compulsive behavior. The 5 days they were missing were simply gone, erased from their minds. Upon their release from the hospital, all 3 researchers immediately and irrevocably altered the course of their lives. Dr. Sinclair retired from academic life entirely and moved to a small town in southern Ontario to teach high school science. Dr. McLeod accepted a position with a private consulting company specializing in urban development projects, a job that would ensure she would never again have to work in a remote wilderness area. Martin Dubois abandoned his graduate studies in geology and enrolled in law school. None of them has ever been willing to discuss the incident publicly. The official investigation concluded that the researchers had suffered some form of collective psychological episode, possibly triggered by stress, isolation, or an unknown environmental factor. But this was just a convenient label for something that had no explanation. The research site in the Ogilvy Mountains was quietly abandoned. I believe they encountered something in those remote mountains that our science cannot yet comprehend. Something that affected their minds in a way that wiped them clean and left behind only a single horrifying compulsive behavior. And on some deep subconscious level, even though they couldn't consciously remember what happened, they retained an instinctive primal fear of ever encountering it again. My name is Jean-Paul Dubois. In the summer of 1998, I was 19 years old, trying to earn money for college by working the graveyard shift at the only 24-hour gas station in Carmacks. Carmacks is a small community of about 500 people, a quiet but important stopping point on the Klondike Highway. During the day, the station was busy with truckers, tourists, and miners. But the night shift, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., was usually dead quiet. Most nights I'd spend my time reading, restocking shelves, and watching the clock. But the night of June 15, 1998 was different. That was the night a man stumbled into the station and brought a nightmare with him. It was around 2:30 a.m. when the glass door opened and a man staggered in. He was a white male, approximately 35 years old, of medium height and build. He was wearing jeans and a plaid shirt that was torn at the shoulder and stained with dark, wet patches of what was clearly blood. His face and hands were covered in fresh scratches, and he was breathing heavily, his eyes wide with a mixture of panic and exhaustion. He immediately came up to the counter where I was sitting and began talking rapidly, his words tumbling over each other as he tried to explain what had happened to him. His name was Thomas Brennan, and he claimed to be driving from Whitehorse to Dawson City. He said that south of Carmax, around midnight, he had stopped to pick up a hitchhiker. It was a young Aboriginal woman, he said, probably in her early 20s, standing beside the highway with her thumb out. He told me he had felt sorry for her, out there alone in the cold and dark. According to his story, the woman had gotten into his pickup truck and told him she was trying to get to Dawson City to visit family. For the first few kilometers, everything had been normal. They had made small talk about the weather and the road conditions. But as they approached the outskirts of Carmax, Brennan claimed the woman's demeanor had suddenly and violently changed. She had become agitated and aggressive, accusing him of driving too fast and demanding that he pull over immediately. When he had tried to calm her down, she had pulled out a knife and threatened to kill him. Brennan told me that he had managed to slam on the brakes and get out of the truck before she could stab him, but that she had chased him with the knife, slashing at him and trying to cut his throat. He claimed that he had fought her off and managed to escape into the woods, but that she had gotten away with his truck and all of his belongings. The scratches on his face and hands were from the knife attack, he said, and the blood on his shirt was his own. He was frantic and he wanted me to call the RCMP immediately so they could catch this dangerous woman and recover his stolen vehicle. The story seemed plausible enough, and Brennan appeared genuinely traumatized. I called the RCMP detachment in Whitehorse and reported the incident, providing them with Brennan's description of the hitchhiker and his truck. While we waited for the police to arrive, I gave Brennan a cup of coffee and a clean towel. He continued to talk about the attack, providing more and more details about the woman's appearance and her unhinged behavior, expressing concern for other motorists who might fall into her trap. 2 RCMP officers arrived about an hour later. They took his report very seriously, immediately putting out a bulletin for the stolen truck and the suspect, described as armed and dangerous. They arranged for Brennan to be taken to the local nursing station to have his injuries treated. Before they left, they took a statement from me about what Brennan had told me and his condition when he arrived. The investigation ramped up quickly. Roadblocks were set up. Local radio stations broadcast warnings. But as the hours turned into a day, inconsistencies began to emerge in Brennan's story. The first problem was that no one else had seen the hitchhiker. Several long-haul truckers who had driven that same stretch of highway around midnight reported seeing no one. More significantly, Brennan's injuries were not consistent with his description of a frenzied knife attack. The scratches were superficial, parallel, and in places he could have easily reached himself. They looked more like self-inflicted marks than defensive wounds. Then on June 17th, 2 days after the incident, a local Aboriginal woman named Sarah Nako was reported missing by her family. Sarah was 23 years old and lived with her grandmother in Carmax. She had last been seen on the evening of June 15th, when she had told her grandmother she was going for her usual evening walk along the river. The timing of her disappearance, combined with the growing holes in Brennan's story, led investigators to take a much closer look at him. When they re-interviewed him, his story began to change. Details became vague. He couldn't explain why he, a supposed stranger to the area, had been on a secondary road instead of the main highway. On June 20th, officers obtained a search warrant for Brennan's motel room in Whitehorse. There, among his belongings, they found several pieces of women's jewelry that Sarah's grandmother identified as belonging to her granddaughter. They also found a disposable camera. The developed photos were of Sarah, taken from a distance without her knowledge. He had been stalking her. The final horrific piece of the puzzle fell into place shortly after. Investigators, no longer looking for a stolen truck but for a grave, found Sarah's body buried in a shallow pit beside the Yukon River, in a remote area accessible only by an old mining road. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The physical evidence at the burial site and in Brennan's motel room linked him directly to the crime. When confronted with this evidence, Brennan finally confessed. There had been no hitchhiker. He had been stalking Sarah for weeks. On the night of June 15th, he had abducted her during her walk, taken her to that remote location and killed her. The entire story about the hitchhiker was a carefully constructed alibi designed to cast himself as the victim and to send the police searching for a fictional suspect, giving him time to get away. He had inflicted the injuries on himself to make his story more believable. Thomas Brennan was convicted of first-degree murder. The investigation later revealed a pattern of similar behavior in other provinces, where he had been a person of interest in the disappearances of other young women. He was a predator who used a mask of victimhood as a weapon. The case was a brutal introduction for me and for the community of Carmacks to the reality that the most monstrous evil can be the one that asks you for help. Its face a perfect portrait of innocence and fear. My name is Daniel Roy, and I've been a bush pilot in the Yukon for over 25 years. I've flown supplies to the most remote mining camps, transported geologists to uncharted territories, and medevaced the sick and injured from communities that are just dots on a map. In that time, I've seen things that would make a city person's blood run cold. Weather that can tear a plane apart. Wilderness so vast it can swallow you whole. I've always been a practical, no-nonsense pilot. I believe in aerodynamics, meteorology, and checklists. I don't believe in ghosts, but there is one valley in the Richardson Mountains, an unnamed, insignificant-looking cut in the landscape on my aeronautical charts that I refuse to fly over anymore. Not after what I witnessed on a clear October afternoon in 1999. I was flying a routine supply run in my de Havilland DHC-6 Twin Otter, a reliable workhorse of a plane. My destination was a remote mining operation near the border with the Northwest Territories. I had 2 replacement workers as passengers in the cabin. The weather forecast was perfect. Clear skies and moderate winds. It was supposed to be an easy, uneventful flight. About 2 hours into the journey, as we were flying over the rugged peaks of the Richardson Mountains, I spotted a valley that was not on my usual flight path. It was oriented perfectly, a straight shot that could shave about 15 minutes off my flight time and save a significant amount of fuel. In the north, efficiency isn't just about saving money, it's about extending your safety margin. I checked my charts. The valley was unnamed but clearly marked as navigable. There were no warnings or restrictions noted. It looked no different from dozens of other valleys I had flown through. I informed my passengers of the route change and began a gradual descent to fly through the valley rather than over the surrounding peaks. As we entered the valley, flying at approximately 2,000 feet above the valley floor, the first thing I noticed was that my radio equipment began to crackle with static. It wasn't severe, but it was unusual, as the signal had been crystal clear just moments before. I dismissed it as a radio shadow effect, common when flying through deep mountainous terrain. Then I looked down at the valley floor, and what I saw made no sense. There were people down there, not just a few hikers, but dozens of them, all running in the same direction as if they were fleeing from some unseen threat. From my altitude, I could see that they were dressed in what looked like historical clothing, animal skins and rough-spun fabrics, not the modern, brightly colored outdoor gear you would expect. My first thought was that I was witnessing some kind of emergency, perhaps a historical reenactment group that had run into trouble. I considered changing course to get a closer look to see if they needed help. But as I banked the aircraft for a better view, the scene below shifted from strange to impossible. The figures were running across terrain, steep, rocky slopes and deep ravines at a speed that would have been impossible for any living person. They moved with a fluid, effortless grace, leaping across chasms and scrambling up inclines without any apparent hesitation. And then I noticed the most disturbing detail. They appeared to be translucent. They were like ghostly, three-dimensional projections on the landscape, their forms shimmering in the afternoon light. As I continued to watch, their behavior changed. They stopped running and began to turn as one to look up at our aircraft. They started pointing at us, their arms raised, their gestures frantic, as if they were trying to communicate, or perhaps to warn us about something. Their faces, which had been indistinct from our altitude, suddenly became sharp and clear despite the distance. They were twisted in expressions of absolute soul-shattering terror and desperation. Then I began to hear them screaming. This should have been impossible. We were flying at 2,000 feet in a pressurized aircraft with two powerful turboprop engines roaring. But their screams were coming through the radio system, cutting through the static as clearly as if they were sitting in the cabin with us. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard before. A chorus of pure, undiluted agony, pain, and fear. It was the sound of people experiencing something so horrible that it transcended normal human suffering. The two passengers in the cabin had also realized that something was terribly wrong. One of them, a mining engineer, yelled over the engine noise, asking if I was receiving some kind of emergency broadcast. The other pointed out the window, his face pale, and asked if I could see the people on the ground. It was a small, cold comfort to know that I was not hallucinating. As the screaming continued, my aircraft began to experience severe mechanical problems. The engine performance indicators on my dashboard began fluctuating wildly, showing readings that made no physical sense. The flight controls became sluggish and unresponsive, as if some external force was resisting my inputs. Most alarming of all, the altimeter began to show that we were losing altitude rapidly, even though I had not changed the engine settings. Looking outside, I could see that we were indeed descending toward the valley floor, as if we were being pulled down by an invisible hand. The screaming figures below had stopped gesturing. They were now standing still, all facing upward toward our aircraft, their arms extended as if they were trying to grab us, to pull us down to join them in their torment. As we continued to descend against my will, I could see their faces more clearly. They were the faces of corpses, showing gruesome, fatal injuries, wounds from weapons, signs of burning, crushing injuries. But their eyes were still alive, still aware, and filled with a desperate, hungry need. They wanted us to join them. I realized we were in immediate danger of crashing. With a surge of adrenaline, I slammed the throttles to full power and fought the controls with all my strength, pulling the plane into a steep, desperate climb, aiming for the ridgeline that marked the boundary of the valley. The moment we crossed it, everything stopped. The radio interference vanished. The engine performance returned to normal. The controls responded crisply, and the screaming stopped as abruptly as it had begun. We completed the flight to the mining camp in stunned silence. I never filed a report on the supernatural aspects of the incident, but I did my own research. I discovered that historical records and local Gwich'in oral traditions described a brutal massacre that had occurred in that very valley 2 centuries ago. An entire band of people taking refuge from a blizzard had been trapped and systematically hunted down and slaughtered by their enemies over a period of several days. The oral history specifically mentioned that the screams of the victims had echoed off the valley walls for days. The place had been considered cursed, a place of profound sorrow ever since. I believe that certain locations can retain the psychic imprint of traumatic events. The valley in the Richardson Mountains is one such place where the boundary between the past and the present has become permeable. The figures we saw were not ghosts in the traditional sense, but the preserved, looping memory of people who died in circumstances so horrible that their final moments became permanently etched into the landscape itself. And that memory is not passive, it is active and it is hungry. My grandfather, Jacques Fournier, was a construction foreman who spent his life digging in the frozen earth of the Yukon. He had helped build roads, airstrips, and foundations in some of the most remote locations in the territory. He thought he had seen everything the permafrost could yield up. He had unearthed the massive bones of woolly mammoths and the perfectly preserved, mummified carcasses of Ice Age creatures that looked like they had died yesterday rather than 10,000 years ago. But what his crew discovered in the summer of 1978, while excavating the foundation for a new community center in the small Gwich'in community of Old Crow, was something so impossible, so world-altering, that the Canadian government went to extraordinary lengths to ensure the story was never told. Old Crow is located about 800 kilometers north of Whitehorse, well above the Arctic Circle. In 1978, the community was getting a new, modern community center. My grandfather's crew was contracted to excavate the foundation. The work was challenging. Below a thin, active layer of soil that thawed in the summer, the ground was permafrost. A rock-hard mixture of frozen soil, gravel, and ice that had been solid for millennia. The crew had to use industrial jackhammers and specialized steam-thawing equipment to break through it. On July 15th, after about 3 weeks of slow, arduous work, they had reached a depth of approximately 4 feet when they struck something unusual. Instead of the typical opaque, soil-filled permafrost, they encountered a thick 6-inch layer of perfectly clear, transparent ice. It extended across the entire excavation area. At first, they assumed it was just a large lens of ground ice, a common formation. But as they began to carefully thaw the surface with the steam wands, they realized that the dark shapes suspended within the ice were not rocks or air bubbles. They were bodies. They were human bodies, perfectly preserved and appearing as fresh as if they had been frozen just days earlier. They were positioned in various poses, as if caught in the middle of their daily lives. A woman holding a small child, 2 men appearing to be in conversation. All of them were dressed in clothing that appeared to be made from animal skins and furs. But the style and construction were unlike anything my grandfather, or later the experts, had ever seen. My grandfather immediately stopped all work and contacted his supervisors in the territorial government, as required by law when human remains are found. Within 2 days, the remote community of Old Crow was quietly inundated with unannounced visitors. Representatives from the Territorial Archaeological Service, the RCMP, and several stern-faced men in dark suits who identified themselves only as being from the Department of Indian Affairs arrived to take control of the site. The entire area was cordoned off, as the crew continued to carefully thaw the ice layer under the strict supervision of the archaeologists. They uncovered a total of 7 bodies, 3 adult males, 2 adult females, an adolescent who appeared to be about 14 years old, and a young child of about 8. All of them were in remarkable condition, with no signs of decay or deterioration. Their skin had a slightly bluish-gray tint, but their facial features were perfectly preserved, their hair and clothing showing no signs of damage. Initial carbon dating samples taken from the clothing and organic materials found with the bodies suggested an astonishing age. Over 10,000 years old. What happened next was what convinced my grandfather that he had witnessed a miracle or a nightmare. As the bodies were being carefully lifted from the melting ice and prepared for transport to government laboratories, they began to show signs of life. It started with barely perceptible movements, a slight twitch of a finger, a flutter of an eyelid, what appeared to be a very slow, shallow intake of breath. The archaeologists and government officials initially dismissed these observations as tricks of the light or the result of muscle contractions during the thawing process. But as the bodies were exposed to the warmer air temperatures, the signs of life became increasingly obvious and undeniable. Eyes that had been closed began to open, revealing pupils that responded to light. Chests began to rise and fall with a slow, rhythmic motion. Most dramatically, several of the bodies began to make quiet vocalizations, guttural sounds that sounded like attempts to speak in a language that none of the observers could identify. The adult male, who appeared to be the oldest of the group, was the first to show clear signs of consciousness. His eyes opened fully and moved around, darting from one modern face to another as if he was trying to make sense of his surroundings. He attempted to sit up, his movements slow and unsteady, like someone recovering from a long illness. When one of the government officials tried to communicate with him, he responded with what sounded like questions, his voice raspy, speaking in a language that had elements similar to various indigenous languages but was unlike any known dialect. Over the next several hours, all 7 of the bodies showed increasing signs of life and awareness. They appeared confused and deeply frightened by their surroundings, particularly by the presence of people in modern clothing, the sound of machinery, and the English language being spoken around them. The younger individuals clung to the adults. Medical examinations revealed that their vital signs, while weak, were present. They had heart rates. They were breathing. They were, by every medical definition, alive. But their revival was tragically and horrifyingly temporary. Despite the frantic efforts of the medical personnel on site to stabilize and warm them, the individuals began to deteriorate with shocking speed once they were fully exposed to the normal air temperatures. Their skin began to darken and show signs of rapid decomposition. Their vital signs became increasingly erratic. It was as if their bodies, having been held in perfect stasis for 10 millennia, were now trying to catch up on thousands of years of natural decay in a matter of hours. Within 12 hours of being removed from the ice, all 7 individuals had died, their bodies rapidly decomposing into little more than skeletal remains and dust. The entire incident was immediately and completely classified by the federal government under the Official Secrets Act. All personnel who had witnessed the events, including my grandfather and his entire crew, were required to sign legally binding non-disclosure agreements that prohibited them from ever discussing what they had seen, under threat of severe legal consequences. The remains were taken to undisclosed government research facilities. The community center project was officially canceled, the reason given as unforeseen geological instability and budget constraints. The excavation site was filled in, and the area was later designated as a culturally sensitive heritage site, ensuring that no one would ever dig there again. My grandfather was told that the incident had never occurred, but he never forgot. He believed that the 7 individuals had been caught in some kind of cataclysmic rapid climate change event that had flash-frozen them in a state of suspended animation. Their brief, tragic return to life proved that the boundary between life and death was not as absolute as we believe. He made me promise that I would one day share the story, because he believed the world had a right to know what was buried in the ice, and what is still waiting to be found as the permafrost continues to thaw. My great-grandmother, Emilie Lavoie, was one of the few women who made the treacherous journey over the Chilkoot Pass during the Klondike Gold Rush. She was not a prospector, but the wife of one, my great-grandfather, Philippe, a man who had been swept up in the fever and had gambled everything they owned on the promise of northern gold. On her deathbed in 1965, she told me a story she had kept secret for over 60 years. A story about the winter of 1898 when starvation and isolation drove men to commit acts so unthinkable that the survivors swore a pact of silence. By the fall of 1898, the initial excitement of the gold rush had given way to a harsh reality. The easily accessible gold was gone, and latecomers like Philippe found themselves broke and stranded as winter approached. Lacking the funds to return home to Quebec, Philippe and 5 other prospectors in similar desperate circumstances decided to pool their meager resources and spend the winter together. They took shelter in a large abandoned cabin near the mouth of El Dorado Creek, in an area that was extremely isolated, more than 20 kilometers from the nearest neighbor. The group consisted of Philippe, a man named Antoine Berube, a burly former logger from New Brunswick, 2 brothers, Paul and Henri Dubois, who had been farmers from Ontario, and an older man named Joseph Martineau, a former fur trapper and the only one with any real knowledge of northern survival. They had managed to accumulate enough food to last approximately 4 months, if they were ruthlessly frugal. The winter of 1898-99 arrived early and with unprecedented ferocity. By November, the temperature had plunged to 50 degrees Celsius and stayed there. Snow fell almost daily, piling up in massive drifts that made travel impossible. The 6 men were completely cut off from the world. Their food supplies, which had seemed adequate in the fall, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. The extreme cold meant their bodies burned more calories just to stay alive. By January, they were down to 1 small, unsatisfying meal per day. By February, they were facing the very real prospect of starvation. It was during this period of increasing desperation that Antoine Berube began making what he called hunting trips. Despite the dangerous cold, he would leave the cabin for hours at a time and return with small amounts of fresh meat, which he claimed to have obtained by snaring rabbits or ptarmigan. The other men, weak with hunger, were too grateful to question his success, especially when their own attempts to hunt had yielded nothing. The meat was always cut into small, unidentifiable pieces and mixed into a thin stew. As the weeks passed, an unsettling pattern emerged. While the other men grew weaker and more emaciated, Antoine seemed to maintain his strength and vigor. He continued to make his hunting expeditions and provide meat for the communal pot, though he was always vague about where and how he was obtaining it. When the others asked to accompany him, he would refuse, claiming his methods required stealth and solitude. The first disappearance occurred in early March. Paul Dubois, the younger of the 2 brothers, failed to wake up one morning. Antoine announced grimly that Paul had succumbed to starvation during the night. This seemed plausible given how weak all of them had become. However, when the others wanted to see the body to say a prayer and discuss a burial, Antoine insisted that he had already taken care of it, having moved the corpse outside and buried it in the snow to prevent the spread of any potential disease. A week later, Henri Dubois also disappeared during the night. Once again, Antoine claimed the man had died from malnutrition and that he had disposed of the body for the health of the survivors. By this time, Philippe and Joseph Martineau were becoming deeply suspicious. They had noticed that Antoine's hunting expeditions had become less frequent since the 2 deaths. Yet he continued to provide a steady supply of meat for their meals. The horrible, unthinkable truth began to dawn on Philippe one afternoon when he went outside to relieve himself behind the cabin. Partially buried in a snowdrift, he found a pile of bones. They were too large to have come from any rabbit or ptarmigan. And among them he saw a fragment of a human jawbone and several vertebrae. He also found scraps of blood-stained clothing that he recognized as having belonged to Paul and Henri Dubois. The bones showed clear marks from a knife and a saw. His stomach churning with bile and horror, Philippe confronted Antoine. At first, Antoine denied everything, But under the combined, desperate questioning of Philippe and Joseph, he finally broke. With a chilling lack of remorse, he admitted that he had been murdering his companions to survive. He confessed that he had been planning it from the beginning of the winter, deliberately underestimating their rations and hoarding food for himself, allowing the others to gradually weaken to the point where they would be unable to resist. The meat they had been eating for weeks, the meat that had kept them alive, had been the flesh of their dead friends. The revelation was a spiritual cataclysm for Philippe and Joseph, but their immediate concern was survival. It was clear that Antoine, the strongest among them, intended to kill them both as soon as he felt it was necessary. That night, they waited until Antoine was in a deep sleep. Then, gathering what few supplies they could carry, they slipped out of the cabin into the brutal 50-degree Arctic night. Their journey to Dawson City was a week-long odyssey of suffering. They survived by digging snow shelters and sharing their body heat. Both men suffered severe frostbite, but they managed to reach the town alive, where they immediately reported Antoine's crimes to the Northwest Mounted Police. A police expedition to the cabin found Antoine Berube in the final stages of starvation, surrounded by the butchered remains of his victims. He was too weak to resist arrest and made a full confession. He was tried and convicted of murder, but he died in custody before his sentence could be carried out. The authorities, fearing that stories of cannibalism would damage the reputation of the Klondike, sealed the official records of the case. My great-grandmother said that Philippe never recovered. The frostbite left him permanently disabled, but the psychological wounds were deeper. The knowledge that he had been forced to consume human flesh haunted him until the day he died. He would wake up screaming from nightmares about the winter at the cabin. The experience had changed him so fundamentally that he was never the same person again. Her story was a chilling reminder that the veneer of civilization is fragile, and that in the face of extreme desperation, the most terrible monsters can be the ordinary men sitting right beside you.